The committee will come to order, and good afternoon. Let me apologize first to our very distinguished witnesses for the lateness. We did have a series of votes. It's the only reason why we are late, but again, it infringes on your time. So thank you for your patience, and to everyone who is here today. Good afternoon. Today's hearing will examine U.S. actions to support the March 2013 elections in Kenya, a critically important African ally. The United States has devoted more than $35 million since 2010 alone to prepare for and manage this year's election process. After the massive violence following the closely contested December 2007 election, many precautions were taken to prevent a similar occurrence in 2013, and Election Day and post-election violence has been greatly reduced. However, an effort to use new technology did not work as well as hoped. There were questions about the effectiveness of this election, which had promised to be a technological advancement. Given future important African elections, this hearing will look at what a responsible U.S. policy towards African elections should look like in an era of constrained development aid budgets. The tragic Election Day deaths of 19 people, although attributed mostly to Islamic separatist elements and not to specifically election-related causes, cannot be overlooked, and the perpetrators must be held to account. It is unacceptable that in the violence that followed the 2007 elections, an estimated 1,200 Kenyans, and there are different estimates, some say 1,000, some say more, were killed, and approximately 600,000 were displaced, according to the media reports. Yet no one thus far has been held accountable. Kenya this year conducted its first election under the 2010 Constitution. In addition to voting for a president and members of the National Assembly, Kenya selected members of a new Senate, as well as governors and local assembly representatives in the 47 newly created counties, each with a designated women's representative. More technology was brought into polling places to better ensure accuracy of voting and vote tabulation. Unfortunately, reported malfunctions of some equipment in some polling stations at the national level, where server breakdown for a while stoked fears of vote rigging. If the court process had not been handled well as it was, we might be looking at another wave of post-election violence. Uhuru Kenyatta was elected president, as we know, with 6,173,433 votes to 5,340,546 votes for Mr. Odinga. And this was certified by the Kenyan Supreme Court, which coincidentally today issued a further elaboration and made very clear that although there were some anomalies, this election was indeed properly conducted. Nevertheless, the violence that was a possibility until Mr. Odinga gave a magnanimous concession speech following the first court ruling. The amount of U.S. support for the Kenyan election was extraordinary. American and Kenyan civil society organizations were enabled in order to conduct civic education, including radio and television messages and programs aimed at youth to encourage participation in the election process, as well as to discourage violence. Youth organizations were created nationwide to give young people an enduring voice in their country's political system. Several innovative approaches were created, including a comic book called Shoe Jazz, with young characters involved in commenting on the Kenyan political process. The three organizations presenting testimony today all played major and very important roles in the creative preparations for the 2013 Kenyan election. The International Republican Institute printed nearly 1.2 million sample ballots and 400,000 election posters for the IEBC, and also distributed some 800,000 Shoe Jazz posters. The National Democratic Institute conducted an important poll on voter attitudes heading into the election, covering such issues as whether the country was headed in the right direction, whether their lives would improve during the next 5 years, whether the election posed a security threat to them and their community, and whether they felt others were being encouraged to do harm to their ethnic group because of the elections. Of course, these organizations did so much more, which will be elaborated on in their testimonies. The International Foundation for Electoral Systems advised Kenya's Electoral Commission on the process to conduct an election where there were 1,882 different configurations of the ballot, depending on the local races being run. An enormous undertaking. The cell phones necessary for reporting of Vote totals from polling stations were so late in being procured, however, that IFES went ahead and purchased 1,200 to send into the field in time for Election Day. Despite the extraordinary efforts by NGOs in preparing for the Kenyan election, we must be selective in what lessons we take from this experience. We will not be able to devote such resources to what will be several important elections yet to be held in 2013 in other countries. The U.S. government has pressed both the governments of Mali and Madagascar to hold elections at the earliest possible date in order to normalize relations after coups replaced elected leaders. Zimbabwe, which recently held a constitutional referendum, is scheduled to hold a presidential and legislative elections that many in that country hope will break the long cycle of repression of political opposition. There was a report in one of today's newspapers that the Zimbabwe leaders are looking for funds because they are short in terms of election monitoring type funds, so they're making an appeal as well. Ethiopia's next election will replace the late Prime Minister Meles, and also will determine whether the political opposition will have more space to operate than in previous elections. I'll never forget, Greg Simpkins and I traveled right after one of the marred elections. Even though the opposition made significant gains, people were literally gunned down in the streets of Addis, and we were there to raise those issues with Prime Minister Meles. But hopefully the next election will be really, truly free and fair. These elections are important to U.S. foreign policy, as was the election in Kenya. So how do we ensure that they are successful and truly represent the will of the voters if we can't devote the resources as we did in Kenya? What role do we have to play going forward? This is the question we put to today's witnesses, whose organizations have broad experience with African elections and have a unique viewpoint that we hope will allow Congress and the administration to agree on funding for a policy that is fiscally sound while being politically effective. This hearing comes at a critical time since Congress is currently considering our budget for foreign affairs. I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments.
Thank you once again, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on Kenya's recent election and what we can learn from this important period in the country's history, both politically as well as socially. Kenya is an important strategic partner to the United States, and the most recent election provides an opportunity to not only better understand elections in this East African nation, but important lessons for the continent as a whole. I want to also acknowledge and thank today's witnesses. Each of you and your organizations participated in the recent elections, and you should be congratulated for your work not only in Kenya, but across Africa to ensure free and fair elections are observed everywhere. I want to make clear from the outset of this hearing that this committee turns its attention to the Kenyan elections because of its importance to the region and the continent. Kenya is said to be the economic engine of East Africa and enjoys a thriving private sector that drives growth and development. And as we address Kenya's election, we do so knowing very well that our own country faces many challenges to ensure that all citizens exercise their right to vote without fear of disenfranchisement and intimidation. The right to vote is at the heart of our democracy and is cherished among those we hold dear. Kenya deserves praise for permitting the courts rather than violence to determine its bright future. In the aftermath of 2007, Kenya endured a dark period that reminded us all of what's at stake. While there were pockets of violence, this by far was the exception rather than the rule. I believe the response following the March 4th election and court ruling made clear that Kenyans chose a future that adheres to peace and the rule of law. In reviewing Mr. Sweeney's remarks for today's hearing, I found his framework for evaluation of the recent election to be both informative and useful. And if you don't mind, I would like to paraphrase from your statement in phrasing how we might consider the recent elections. You wrote, "Did this most recent election reflect the will of the people? Were the investments made in the democratic process well spent, and did they allow important advances to take hold?" In particular, I'd like to know what your thoughts are. Mr. Chairman gave several examples of some of the work of the NGOs in terms of the posters, the comic books, and all of that, and I would like to know your opinions as to whether or not, from all three of you, as to whether or not you thought that really made a big impact. I would like to add an additional question to this thoughtful and pragmatic list. Do the steps taken and investments made provide a model for elections in other countries throughout Africa? As we've seen in the last year, African nations, with some significant exceptions, have embraced democratic processes, the rule of law, and peaceful transitions. Whether through elections or constitutional means, countries like Senegal, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Malawi illustrate a strong and, I believe, lasting shift toward democracy. I would add that we learn much from our success as we do from those things that did not go according to plan. As we will hear from today's witnesses, our focus should cover the broad diversity of success and the obvious challenges, the activities that worked well in addition to those that failed to accomplish its stated objective. As the Congressional Research Service notes, the Kenyan Constitution brought major changes to the government, establishing new checks and balances and a more deliberate separation of powers and devolving considerable powers to a new county level of government. And important changes were made to the administration of the elections, notably the introduction of new technologies designed to enhance the transparency of the process and credibility of the results. Some of these reforms worked well, and while others proved to be inefficient or ineffective, and maybe you could comment specifically where you thought what was insufficient and what wasn't effective. Delays in voter registration and the problems with election equipment resulted in poorly coordinated voter programs. A lack of voter education, voter buying, and intimidation concerned domestic and foreign observers alike. But these are the challenges of a relatively new democracy and a country, I believe, that is committed to improving and strengthening its institutions. Kenya's new president must take heed of the many challenges that were experienced during this most recent election and move swiftly to show that all Kenyans that the new government is willing to build a culture of unity that is inclusive of the country's 50 ethnic groups. The challenge may be great, but the opportunity is even greater. I firmly believe that Kenya's future has never been brighter, and with the election now over, Kenyans proved that the rule of law prevailed over the stinging violence of '07. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I yield to the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning, and a full resume for each of you will be made a part of the record. Beginning with Mr. Paul Fagan, who began his career at the International Republican Institute in 1995. He currently serves as the Regional Director for Africa, where his duties include oversight of the programs in Kenya. He served as IRI's first East Africa resident regional director based in Kenya, and oversaw IRI's programs ahead of the Kenyan historic 2002 elections, and also implemented IRI's first series of political party programs in Somaliland. He later served as acting Deputy Director for Africa and has served on election observation missions in Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kenya, Liberia, Nigeria, Somaliland, and the Ukraine. We'll then hear from Dr. Keith Jennings, who is a Senior Associate and Regional Director for Southern and East Africa for NDI. Over the past 15 years, he has represented NDI in 30 countries, working on average on a range of governance, civil society, political party, and election programs. He has managed several of NDI's largest programs, having served as the Institute's Country Director for Liberia, Mozambique, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia, among others. He is author of numerous popular and scholarly articles on a range of human rights and democratic development subjects. He's also been a frequent media commentator on foreign affairs. And then we'll hear from Mr. Bill Sweeney, who serves as the President and CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. Prior to these positions, he also served as Board of Directors and was Chairman of that organization. He has a lifelong background in democracy promotion and public policy, with considerable experience in both the public and private sectors. He was Deputy Chairman of the Democratic National Committee and Executive Director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He has also been an official election observer in the Philippines, Russia, Jamaica, and Nicaragua. Mr. Fagan, if you could begin, and welcome to all three of you.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, along with my colleagues from NDI and IFES, who we work closely with around the world. Since its independence 50 years ago, Kenya has been a strategic ally of the United States. IRI has been active in Kenya since 1992, and having worked to strengthen democratic institutions since then. The recent March elections signaled many changes for the nation. Mr. Chairman, I believe that it's important to talk about the challenges Kenya has faced in the lead up to these elections, examine the democratization process the country is undergoing, and then discuss ways in which the United States can continue to foster a strong relationship with its strongest ally in East Africa. Furthermore, the just concluded general elections and the comprehensive approach of the United States assistance should be examined as a possible model for future electoral assistance in Kenya and other countries. The flawed 2007 elections and the senseless violence that followed signaled to the world that democratization is an ongoing process that can be derailed if not supported. After the international community stepped in to help broker peace in Kenya, it was clear that more was needed to preserve the progress made over the years. The result of the efforts occurred on March 4, 2013, when Kenyans overwhelmingly went to the polls. The number of votes was not only large, but it was the most ever, with more than 86% of registered voters participating in the election. 5 years on, and Kenyans have emerged from a dark chapter in their nation's history. While Kenyans today are largely optimistic about the future of their country, this optimism and the reforms of the past 5 years faced a crucial test on March 4th. In the lead up to these elections, there were signs of progress as well as concern. A particular emphasis should be focused on the Independent Elections Boundaries Commission, or the IEBC, the judiciary, the media, civil society, and political parties. All of these institutions deserve credit for the role they play to ensure a peaceful process, but many Kenyans still have concerns about them. The institution that still remains at the center of discussion is the IEBC, which organized a relatively good election. However, there were moments that could have derailed its efforts, such as the delayed voter registration process, the failure of the electronic voter identification machines on voting day in many of the voting centers, and the flawed electronic submissions results process. Kenyans had expected the presidential results within 48 hours, but due to the flawed electronic results system, results were not shared until March 9th, 5 days after the conclusion of the election. The political parties need to continue to be reformed with a focus on party finance laws, inclusion of marginalized groups such as women and youth, and being run more transparently. Women in particular were supposed to be big winners in these elections, but they were not, and the parties could have played a much more positive role in getting women elected. Generally, the media contributed to a peaceful election by broadcasting accurate and balanced stories. News outlets reminded Kenyans to keep the peace, and many articles were written about the need to avoid political violence. And civic and non-governmental organizations played a significant and essential role in Kenya. In the lead up to the election, civic organizations were invaluable to the electoral process, and it is important to maintain their ability to participate in the future. And lastly, Kenya's judiciary was key to the success of these elections. It was front and center throughout the process. The reforms the judiciary had gone laid the groundwork for the type of confidence witnessed during the Supreme Court hearing on Raila Odinga's petition. The court's proceedings were made live on television, allowing millions of Kenyans to tune in, watch the proceedings, and then decide for themselves how they feel about the process. These elections demonstrated that Kenyans can and will turn to their courts for justice. It cannot be ignored that each of the sectors mentioned above, the IEBC, the political parties, the media, civil society, and the judiciary, all benefited tremendously from the international community. Kenyans and Kenyan institutions, of course, deserve the credit, but the donor community's role was significant. In particular, it was clear that the United States electoral assistance led by the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, was important when it came to teamwork and building synergies at all levels among implementers in Kenya. Kenya benefited from this holistic approach, and as such, no stone lay unturned in the efforts to support Kenyans in having a peaceful and successful election. IRI in particular benefited from USAID support, but we have to thank the National Endowment for Democracy for its continued support for IRI's programs there as well, and its continued support for democracy in Kenya and around the world. Overall, IRI remains optimistic about the progress made throughout the elections process. We recognize that more work needs to be done. However, there are obvious issues to reconcile regarding the future of the United States relations with Kenya, since President Uhuru Kenyatta and Vice President William Ruto have been indicted by the ICC for claims that they incited violence immediately following the 2007 elections. It remains unclear how our government will interact with Kenya moving forward. It's a difficult situation. Mr. Chairman, Kenya has the ability to lead the way in Africa for key reforms that embolden marginalized groups and give all citizens the ability to freely and openly participate in their government. If this works, Kenya will be a success story in Africa and beyond. IRI is committed to continuing its efforts to promote democratic governance throughout Kenya by empowering local governments and providing them with the support they need to be successful. We believe that, in turn, the devolution process will be stronger and provide greater opportunities for all Kenyans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Fagan, thank you so very much. Dr. Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the subcommittee, NDI is very happy to have this opportunity to comment on the March 4th elections in Kenya. NDI has worked in Kenya since the mid-1990s, and for the last 5 years has concentrated on helping to facilitate peaceful, credible processes around the 2010 constitutional referendum and on peaceful and credible elections in 2013, as well as continued progress beyond. Mr. Chairman, NDI's election programming in Kenya addresses 6 areas. 1, the Institute's work to promote dialogue among the political parties, the Register of Political Parties, and Independent Election and Boundaries Commission through the political party liaison committees nationally and at the county level in all 47 counties, created a sustainable foundation for political dialogue at the county level going forward, and as well as the national stock-taking process for election processes. By facilitating Kenya's first multi-party youth work through the Inter-Party Youth Forum, hundreds of emerging leaders forged relationships that serve as a break on violence across the country in a manner that can continue to contribute positively over the years ahead. NDI's support for increased women's political participation and representation included training more than 700 women and supporting 96 women candidates to share the platform through radio prior to party nominations. This led to more women being nominated for positions in party primaries and promoted more women as political leaders at the community level. NDI's engagement with civil society organizations working to ensure the participation of persons with disabilities, improved advocacy and awareness of marginalized groups in the March election, and also a stronger focus among the organizations themselves to continue working for their rights within the political system. NDI also provided technical assistance to 11 faith-based civil society organizations that forged the ELOG, the Election Observation Group, which conducted long-term observation and independent verification of the constitutional referendum and the 2013 presidential election through highly accurate parallel vote tabulations. ELOG's PVTs confirmed the official results were within the range of statistical projections, and ELOG also identified areas of action for improving the process going forward. As you said, Mr. Chairman, NDI also conducted survey research on a regular basis that informed a range of political actors, and the organization also conducted an early pre-election delegation that was headed by the former Botswana President, His Excellency Kitumeli Maseri, that laid out a number of gaps in the process that allowed the Election Commission to address those. Mr. Chairman, NDI's activities are supported by a wide variety of international funders, including the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Kingdom of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the United Nations Development Program. The financial assistance NDI received, especially from USAID, occurred ahead of the elections, allowing sufficient time for the Institute to plan and implement a range of long-term activities and also to respond to last-minute contingencies. We believe the funders understood what was at stake in the elections in Kenya and responded accordingly. Mr. Chairman, an accurate and complete assessment of any election must take into account all aspects of the process, and no election can be viewed in isolation from the political context in which it takes place. It should also be noted that no electoral framework is perfect, and that all electoral and political processes experience challenges. The March 4 elections in Kenya were the most complex in the country's history. 6 elections took place on the same day, with a completely new legal framework for both political parties and the election management bodies. And as you mentioned, we should also remember that more than 1,000 people had perished in the last elections and 600,000 or more displaced. Mr. Chairman, I would like to emphasize that NDI did not conduct a comprehensive international election observation mission for Kenya's election, and that ultimately it is the Kenyan people who must determine the meaning of the March 4th polls. However, it is the Institute's view, based on its intensive work, that the Kenyan presidential elections were credible, though the process had many flaws. The unanimous ruling by the Kenyan Supreme Court affirming the outcome of the elections, which was accepted by presidential candidate Raila Odinga after his legitimate challenge before the court, marks an important milestone. Elections are always the product of a political process, and Kenya's 2013 elections resulted from popular reforms that not only set the stage for the vote and for the country to redeem its reputation. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, it is important that we look beyond the presidential elections. For instance, the Jubilee Coalition, headed by Uhuru Kenyatta, won 195 of the 349 National Assembly seats, while the Coalition for Reform and Democracy, headed by Raila Odinga, won 143. In the new Senate, Jubilee secured 34 seats, while CORD won 27 of the 67 seats. At the county level, Jubilee has 24 governors, CORD has 23. And while Jubilee controls 26 county assemblies, CORD controls 21. Sadly, not one woman was elected to the Senate, nor was one woman elected governor. Mr. Chairman, this illustrates that there should not be a zero-sum political attitude suggesting that the winner takes all and the loser loses all following the March elections. While there are likely to be substantial difficulties, especially in the devolution process, there's a basis for positive development, particularly if genuine political space is maintained for opposition parties and dialogue and accountability efforts, and a move away from impunity is guaranteed. Mr. Chairman, the Kenyan electoral process presents lessons that are useful when considering other countries and other elections in Africa and beyond. A few of the most salient are as follows. First, ultimately, it is the people of a country who determine the credibility of their elections and their country's democratic development. Additionally, while elections are a key ingredient to democracy, it should be understood that they are not synonymous with democracy. Thus, there is much more that needs to be done to advance Kenya's democratic process. Secondly, assistance by the international community to support democratic processes should begin early and be robust, coordinated, and conducted in a proactive manner that respects the sovereignty of the host country. In this sense, election assistance must be seen as much more than just a technical matter and should address important factors in the broader political environment, which was done in Kenya. Third, systematic observation of election processes by nonpartisan citizen election monitoring organizations and international observers, which engage constructively with election management bodies, can make vital contributions to improving electoral integrity and public confidence. Such systematic, credible, independent verifications were not present in the 2007 elections. Fourth, developing reliable communications among political parties and election authorities can improve the credibility of election processes and mitigate potentials for election-related violence. The efforts of the IEBC and the political parties through the political party liaison committees at the national and county levels increase the potentials for peaceful, credible elections, including over the tense election results. And finally, Mr. Chair, there appears to be an emerging adherence to the rule of law and recourse to the courts for resolution of election-related disputes, as opposed to past practices of taking to the streets and inciting violence. The court cases in Kenya and Ghana challenging the election results were watershed moments for the African democratization process, especially because the contestants accepted the authority of the courts and of the country's highest courts in both cases. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, it is clear that the recent Kenyan electoral process represents a reversal of the country's 2007-2008 electoral violence. In fact, the elections and the challenges to the results strengthen the democratic institutions of Kenya and hopefully will serve as a hallmark in steering the country towards a culture of peace and tolerance during future elections. NDI stands ready to continue to assist the country. Thank you.
Dr. Jennings, thank you very much as well. And now Mr. Sweeney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Minority Member Bass, for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee on the recent general elections in Kenya. IFES, in a joint venture with the other organizations represented here today, received a grant from USAID in May 2011 to provide technical assistance to build the capability and sustainability of the newly formed Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, known as the IEBC. I was in Kenya during this election and had the chance to meet with Chairman Ahmad Hassan and the IEBC commissioners on several occasions. Kenya will not burn, was what Chairman Hassan said to me. His message was powerful, memorable, and accurate. Mr. Chairman, IFES was able to work with the new Election Commission to implement a number of very high-profile reforms. These include 5 major pieces of new legislation, creating systems to handle political party registration and candidate nomination, redistricting of electoral boundaries, registration of 14.3 million voters in less than 1 month, recruitment and deployment of 260,000 new poll workers, and introduction of biometric voter registration, electronic voter identification, and a results management system. This and more was accomplished in under 15 months. The scale of what the IEBC was able to accomplish was ambitious and impressive, even for the most seasoned election commissions. This election has been recognized as peaceful and credible by most international and domestic stakeholders. Nevertheless, it does raise at least one key question for development agencies and implementing organizations. How can we better help our partners manage expectations when a society demands more change in public administration at a faster pace than can be realistically implemented? In Kenya, there was an attempt to implement too much technology in too short a time. In countries where there is a trust deficit due to both past behaviors and suspicions about the process, the choice often is new election technology. There are issues around adapting, procuring, and then deploying new technology in any political environment. In Kenya, due to massive pressure from the political leaders of all parties and civil society, the IEBC decided to implement 3 new technologies simultaneously. Technologies that were dependent on infrastructure, such as reliable electric power and accessible cellular channels. This situation is where international technical assistance from trusted organizations can make a difference. Some possible outcomes, such as abandoning paper lists at polling stations and completely entrusting new technology, can be walked back. Other decisions can be implemented as best as possible with the partnership of experienced global personnel who know technology and the election process from decades of experience. Election technology in general is a great innovation and can enhance the trust, transparency, and speed of information on Election Day. However, the technology has to work perfectly on Election Day. The election workers have to be trained in how to use the technology. The technology, like all other voting supplies, has to be distributed to the polling places on time. These are all serious logistical issues for every election commission. The Kenya assistance model represents a true partnership and reinforces the importance of international support to election management bodies. Elections are a process, not just an event. The IEBC and IFES are already reviewing lessons learned and how to prepare the reform agenda towards the next elections scheduled for August 2017. Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for your time, and this concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sweeney. And the information you've conveyed, I think, is astounding. 14.3 million voters signed up in less than a month, 32,000 electronic voter identification systems, and the list goes on. I'm wondering, you did say that the failures in technology were really failures of project management. And I wonder if you might want to elaborate on that. You know, I have 2 brothers who are pilots, and they'll always be the first one to say that it's often not the machine, it's pilot error. So are we talking about people just didn't know the process? How would you elaborate on this failure of project management, if you would?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I would never ascribe anything to pilot error.
Okay, you must be a pilot.
However, in the case of Kenya, for example, they accomplished great things. Their registration system involves a photograph and fingerprints. Those were organized onto machines for the 1,000 voters per polling station. And the voters would then use their thumb on the machine so as to pull up identification. That was great as long as either there was electricity in the classroom where the polling place was taking place or the batteries worked. Now, batteries are funny things. Sometimes they say they'll work for 12 hours, but then they're not completely charged. And sometimes they run out of power because to take a thumbprint is a very large draw on a battery. And so 1,000 people over the course of a number of hours, batteries in some cases failed. Now, there was a point where the political process and civil society said, don't continue with the investment in the paper list. Let's completely rely on technology. The IEBC was able to make the point that, first of all, the paper list was what was the official register of voters as stated in the law. It might not have been as fancy and as glitzy, but it was the official register. And secondly, if electric power or battery power failed, you had the backup. But finally, third, the Election Commission invested seriously in the identification process, so there were actual photo IDs, photographs of every voter next to their name because they'd gone through the registration process. And the list was constructed so that it could be used by a polling worker or a series of polling workers over the course of a 12-hour day, be flipped back and forth, and not fall apart. Frankly, in my experience, it was one of the best voter booklets I'd ever seen. And it was sitting there as the backup.
Including here, right?
One of the best I'd ever seen, sir. Okay. Don't choose to revise and extend. Okay. But it worked. And so if the electronic system didn't work, they had the official register of voters with photo IDs in a format that allowed every voter to be serviced by those poll workers. That's an example, if you will, of where technology was great when it worked, and it was really impressive to see person after person put their thumbprint down, see their voter ID come up on that computer screen until the battery gave out.
Yeah.
And so these are some of the issues that you're dealing with. You noted generously in your testimony, in your comments, that IFAS went out and purchased both cell phones as well as SIM cards, so as, because of the lateness of the procurement by the IEBC on the cellular phones and the distribution of them. There were logistical issues in getting all of that out to all of the polling stations. And there were training issues where, frankly, I suspect that some of the polling workers did not know how to put the new SIM cards into the old phones, which resulted in problems. This is quite frankly, not unforeseen, not a surprise. The Kenyan election law allowed both for a provisional vote system so that you had information for the first 3 days. That was always considered provisional and not official. And then the Election Commission had 7 days to go through the process of a hand count of all of the materials as they came into Nairobi. That was all anticipated in the law, as was the period of the appeal process and judicial review. And these were all steps forward because of the disaster of 2007.
You know, it would appear, and all three of you can back this up one way or the other, that the IEBC had a very capable group of talented leaders who knew, not only were well trained, but were also situation awareness types that got the job done, especially in light of the deadlines. You mentioned numerous political agendas. I'm not sure what that means, but if you might want to speak to the importance of having very talented people that you saw on the job, like at the IEBC, I should say, in making this really happen. Because I've met with electoral commissions all over Africa, all over the world, frankly, and some leave a lot to be desired. They're the handmaiden of the ruling party, and they just do whatever the ruling party wants. And when there's a contested election, they find more likely, as we saw in Ethiopia, in favor of what the ruling party wants. If you could speak to that, the talent and
Mr. Chairman, if I can, first of all, if you looked at the criteria to become appointed a member of the IEBC, there were over 150 candidates considered by the Parliament. They had to produce their police records as to whether or not there were any arrests or liens, their income tax forms, all of their political activity. They had to swear not to run for office, I think 5 to 7 years after this election. They took, to my way of thinking, probably the most difficult election commission to be a member of is India's, and they took the India standard, which only allows career civil servants who've got an unblemished record after 20 years of service to become members of the Election Commission. They took the Indian standard to a higher threshold. And the amount of disclosure that these candidates for IBC, all of the candidates, had to submit to their Parliament for selection was, by any standard, simply amazing. Income tax forms, police forms, academic records, everything. And then these men and women were selected, and they were dedicated to fulfilling their mission to their country. I know almost all of the IEBC members, having met with them individually and collectively a number of times over the last 3 years. It is a tremendous group of very committed public servants who come from all walks of life. There was a chemistry teacher, there was from mid-schools, there was a former ambassador to the United States who'd been a career public servant, there was a lawyer, there was an accountant. It was a tremendous group of people who have committed themselves to Kenya's democracy.
Mr. Chairman, I would just add that all the things that my colleague from IFIS just said is true of the commission. However, this is a political process, and there was a moment when the public confidence in the IEBC was lost. That's during the procurement process. There were accusations made of a number of the members, and when the State House, or the equivalent of the White House, intervened, it created a problem. And that problem was difficult to overcome. We worked with the chairman for at least 5 years before he was even the chair of the commission. So in terms of impugning someone's reputation, that's not what I'm trying to point out here, because I think that these are well-known public servants. But in the political process, whether it was true or not, a problem was created because of the procurement issue. The second thing I would add, sir, is that while there were these flaws, we still have to look at the progress that has been made in Kenya. Significant progress, a revolutionary constitution, the best, one of the best on the continent. Besides the constitution itself, the reform of the courts, and perhaps the reason that Raila Odinga went to the courts was because of the confidence people now have. And now the devolutionary process. 47 new states have been created with new assemblies. So while the IEBC's vetting process took place, judges also had to be vetted. And this devolutionary process is very dynamic. It will be difficult for progress to be made in the short term. And I think from the aid effectiveness point of view, that's one thing we have to watch. It's the short-term pressures of an electoral process versus the long-term sustainable development challenges that we face, especially in a country like Kenya that is the hub for security and communications in East Africa. If what we did was good enough to save one life, I don't think we should put a dollar value on it. And I think that in this particular case, the Kenyan people are the ones who should be congratulated, because they had made up their mind through their various peace campaigns that they were not going to go back to the violence of the past.
Mr. Fagan.
I'll just speak quickly to this point, because I believe my colleagues covered it very well. But I think Chairman Hassan did a good job You know, I saw him when he was in Nigeria for those elections, observing just like me. So he took his role very seriously, went to other African elections to see how other institutions were working. And I think that's an important thing for a lot of these chairmen of the election commissions to do, is to get to know other elections on the continent. And Nigeria in 2011 was probably one of the best ones he could have witnessed. As Dr. Jennings mentioned, prior to the elections, there was controversy. There was a crisis in their public image because of the biometric voter registration procurement issue. They probably could have done a much better job in communicating to people, but I think even in the last period between the election and the election results, they kept people informed. They told people about their mistakes. They kept people informed, which was good. But what we think is important, but what the Kenyan people think is much more important. And you have about a 50% of the population that probably very much respects the IEBC and its leadership, but maybe slightly, almost 50% that might not. And we have to remember that other side of the country. So while they conducted themselves very, very well, we have to remember what the Kenyans think. But we also have to remember not just the presidential elections were held. Kenyans voted for 5 other elective positions, and there have been, I don't know the numbers, but very few challenges to those positions. So, all in all, I would say a good elections process and a job done well by the IEBC. A lot of lessons learned, but a good job.
Mr. Fagan, you said in your testimony that President Odinga even commented that Kenya could not be run via Skype at The Hague, a reference to the pending ICC trials against Kenyatta and his running mate. I'm wondering, did the U.S. position on that, the warning that was issued earlier on, have any impact? Did it swing in either way? Was it a non-factor? And people just decided on their own who it is that they wanted to support?
You know, I can't speak for Kenyans on whether, you know, the international community's position on the presidential candidates impacted their votes. You know, I think, you know, some people will say maybe that emboldened some people to vote more because they wanted to say this is a Kenyan election, this is our process, we don't want the interference of the international community. So it's hard to say whether or not the international community's stance, which was never fully, they never fully endorsed one candidate over another, but certainly there were some statements made by officials from our government and other EU governments, which, you know, is probably slightly one candidate over another. Just be careful how Kenyans voted because of the repercussions that could be made. But those repercussions we don't know yet. Both President Uhuru Kenyatta and Vice President Ruto have been cooperating with the ICC. And as long as they cooperate, I think that the U.S. government and other governments will have to take that into consideration in how they deal with them. When we look at Zimbabwe and we look at the sanctions on those leaders, the U.S. government still deals with those leaders. Obviously, President Mugabe is not allowed in this country. But we still have an ambassador there. We still have an ambassador who has presented his credentials to Mugabe. So there are a lot of ways to deal with the Kenyan government. And I think the United States will find ways to do that because it is such an important ally.
Finally, the role of faith-based NGOs and civil society in promoting participation as well as nonviolence. And Dr. Jennings, I think your point made about we need to look beyond just the presidential elections. That breakdown of Jubilee versus the Coalition for Reform and Democracy looks like there were a whole lot of contested elections with not an equal but a very credible outcome that people were picking and choosing rather you know, effectively. They didn't just go for one side. So on those two things, and finally, how can this experience, Mr. Fagan, you talked about how important it was for some to be at other elections, like in Nigeria, where there were many other Africans, particularly those who are in the queue in this year and next, observing and drawing some good lessons learned. And I know, Mr. Sweeney, you said there will be an event very soon on lessons learned. Please convey that, you know, if you would, to the committee, so we could send it out, you know, based on your insights and others as well. But if you could touch on that, then I'll yield to my friend, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can't forget how polarized this environment was. It was a quite volatile situation. And so any advantage that either of the major contestants could find, they would make use of. And I think for the record, we should state and understand that President Obama's statement was very well received. That it wasn't seen as being controversial at all. There were other statements that people tried to say contradicted President Obama's statement. And there was more of a nationalist tone of respect our sovereignty position was taken by a number of the contestants. It's understandable in a political situation that is as close as it was, and everyone predicted. And in fact, we thought there would be a runoff. But the numbers and the results prove that it's still a fairly divided country. Let me just say on the faith-based participation, it was massive. And there were calls for peace for more than a year. The calls were so resounding that many people said they had peace fatigue. But whether it was the churches or the mosques or the synagogues, everyone was calling for peace. And that's what I was saying, referring to earlier, that it was the Kenyan people who had determined. Sadly, 19 deaths did take place. But compared to past electoral violence, not only 2007, but for all of the past elections, it's a very tiny amount of deaths. With respect to the public, I think the role that the media played was significant. People felt like they had clear choices here because of the role of the public debates that took place. And they knew what they were voting for. And again, I think the numbers suggest that the society is fairly clear about which candidate we wanted to vote for. Under this is something that we may be a bit uncomfortable discussing, and that is the fact of ethnic divisions that exist within Kenya. But I think that Mr. Kenyatta and Mr. Ruto are together in an unlikely coalition. And so they should be up to the task of managing the diversity of that country. And I think that's a lesson that, again, is something that can be shared with others in Africa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just make 2 or 3 quick points. Number one, the election commissions in Africa have a history of observing each other's elections. There's a great deal of learning, a great deal of shared experiences. IFES and others helps facilitate that. We had colleagues from the Liberian Election Commission as part of our team in Africa. In Kenya, we hosted an evening of the South African, Nigerian, Liberian, and Kenyan election officials before the election so they could compare notes and then follow up afterwards. There were also a number of senior election administrators from a number of countries who were part of either the Commonwealth Observation Delegation or the European Union Delegation. Former Chairman Qureshi of India, who was very much a mentor to the Kenyan process, was there as a member of the Commonwealth Delegation. So within the industry, if you will, there was a great number of lessons learned from other experiences that were then finally applied in Kenya, but there's never such a thing as a perfect election. So we know that some of those experiences will then show up in trainings and conferences in other countries. That's part of the election administration profession. So that was very robust both before the Kenyan election. The IEBC members were very involved in learning from other societies and countries, and that was evident in both the evolution and passage of 5 new election laws, as well as other issues throughout the entire process. Secondly, the issue that you raised was known to all Kenyan citizens. This was not a secret. It was a matter of public debate. They voted, and they elected a team that was well aware of the questions raised by the ICC. This is not a secret. And it's up to Kenyans as to how they voted and how those campaigns projected that information out to their voters. And No one was shy about it from what I could see. It was a matter of public debate. My final point would be that we are already working with the Kenyan Election Commission, looking at what went wrong, what went right, what we could do better. Some issues are in the law, some issues were in the process of public procurement, some issues were in communications. Every election commission that is professional takes a look at what happened last month and tries to figure out what best. And today's Kenyan Supreme Court comments on the procurement process, I'm sure, will be part of the lessons learned.
Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to take where you were just commenting, Mr. Sweeney, about no election is perfect. You know, and I don't want to discount in any way, shape, or form the violence that took place this time, and of course the violence that took place the last time. But, you know, from your testimony, I think that there's been a lot to be admired. And, you know, I was joking with the chair. I don't know when we had an election turnout where there was 86%. I don't think we'd know what to do. So, you know, I do think we really do. And as a couple of the witnesses said, we need to look at this election in the context of a particular situation. So I wanted to ask a few questions. I believe, Dr. Jennings, you were mentioning that there were no women that were elected as governor or to the upper chamber of the parliament, and that there were 96 female candidates. How many were elected, though, to other positions?
Ms. Bass, let me clarify. There were none elected, but there are 18 who've been appointed. These seats were reserved in the Senate, yes. But out of the 416 members of Parliament, 85 women are there. In the new constitutional arrangement, there was supposed to be
almost our ratio. I think it's a little more.
About 17%, similar to the U.S. Congress. But the point that we were making is that they weren't elected.
I understand that they were appointed. Okay. And in terms of the technology and the machines, where were they made? Where were the voting machines from? The machines that you were talking about, that required the battery, that, you know, electricities, where are they from?
I don't know the exact source of where they were manufactured. The biometric identification system was done by a Canadian firm. The results transmission, I know the phones were primarily Nokia phones, but I can't tell you where they were manufactured. The voter registration process, I'll have to get back to you with the exact locales as to the firms involved in that.
Okay, I'm interested in that, and in particular because, Dr. Jennings, you were pointing out the problems with procurement. Were you referring to the procurement of this technology, or there were other procurement issues as well?
The procurement of some of the technology that was just mentioned, yes.
Okay. In regard to the ICC, I wanted to know if you could, any of you, could speak to the views of the Kenyan public in general toward the ICC, and then in particular, the specific case, the Kenyan case, and do you expect President Kenyatta and Deputy President Ruto to continue to comply? And when are they due to, aren't they due in the next couple of months to go before the ICC?
Yes.
The Vice President has a case at the end of May, and the President has to respond, I believe, at the end of July.
Do you expect them to go?
Well, it's not an issue that NDI covers, ma'am. What I mentioned earlier is that the polarization was in part a result of the fact that you had a contestant and his running mate that had been indicted by the ICC. And prior to the election process taking place, the visit by the Sudanese president to Kenya had become a big issue. So it's only in the political context that we're commenting on it, but NDI doesn't take a position on the ICC or whether or not the candidates will comply.
Okay, and I didn't mean you'd take a position. I just wanted to know your opinions. Maybe the other two witnesses can respond. What do you think is going to happen? Wasn't there an issue before as to whether the witnesses would show up? The witnesses that have made charges against both the president and deputy.
What I would say is just base it on what they themselves have said. You know, during the election campaign, during the 2 debates that took place, President Kenyatta, now President Kenyatta, then Deputy Prime Minister, indicated that he would continue to work with the ICC and attend the hearings. Whether he and President Ruto do that, we'll see. They have indicated they will cooperate. But if they go, I don't think we can
Predict that.
base it on until they go, and that's when, yeah. So we'll have to see.
In the president's inaugural address, he said that he would continue to cooperate with international organizations.
Okay. Mr. Sweeney, did you want to say something?
I just take him at his word, ma'am.
Okay. Right. What is your assessment of rumors that the new Kenyatta government may push for restrictions on civil society? Have you heard those rumors? Do you have any thoughts about them?
Well, actually, it's an unfortunate situation that we are very concerned about space being maintained for civil society. The reforms that we all are congratulating the Kenyans about actually were largely a result of active civil society pushing for these reforms for more than 2 decades. There's a bill that was recently adopted, and it just coincides with the election of President Kenyatta. But that bill was promulgated prior to his election, which does close space. Just recently, as in yesterday, more than 8,500 civil society organizations have reapplied for their registration. And one of the things that we have said, and we would hope that the new government would pay attention to, is that as long as there is space for a vibrant civil society, then it is possible that these reforms can be achieved. And that is the real measure of whether or not the investments made by governments like the United States or other governments was worth the investment or not, because that's, at the end of the day, whether the Kenyan people can live in a democratic society and there's an inclusive social and economic development process is the real measure of what we do.
You want to say, can you tell me what you think Odinga's role will be now? You know, especially when I was looking at the ratios in terms of the majority and minority parties, they're, you know, almost neck and neck. Does he continue to play a leading role in opposition even though he lost the election? What do you anticipate from him?
Raila Odinga has been in politics his whole life.
Right.
You know, his father was the first vice president. Kenyatta's father was the first president.
Right.
So historically, he's been connected to the politics of that country since probably almost his birth. So I would expect Raila Odinga to continue to play a prominent role in politics. Will he run for president again? I don't know. You know, anything's possible. And, you know, if you look at history, if you look at Raila Odinga, if you look at the major political actors over the past, I would say, even 2 decades, they reinvent themselves. They join different political parties.
We know about that, too.
Yeah, there's a lot of party hopping. He joined KANU when, as the ruling party. He was thrown in jail under KANU and President Moi. I think, you know, Raila Odinga, you know, plays an important role in Kenya. He's a leader of one of the largest ethnic communities, but he's also a leader of many different political parties in the past and probably in the future. So he will continue to play a major role in this whole process. I don't doubt it. And I think maybe Dr. Jennings had mentioned this. You know, President Kenyatta and Vice President Ruto were completely at odds in the last election.
Right.
So anything can happen in Kenyan politics. So I can't predict who's going to be doing what probably in the next 5 years or 2 years, because these alliances could change very quickly.
I know a number of the news reports that this being his 3rd try, that he probably wouldn't run again, but
Ms. Bass, I would say, excuse me, I would say that as Mr. Sweeney said about Kenyatta, take him at his word. I think we can definitely take Raila Odinga at his word. During his congratulatory remarks to Mr. Kenyatta, he said, "We are now the official opposition." I think that he is a African leader that is well known on the continent of Africa. And he's been active, as Paul mentioned, for more than 4 decades. He's an international figure. Our understanding is that he's met twice already with Uhuru Kenyatta. What they talked about, I have no way of knowing, but it would seem to me that to walk away from the numbers that I just read might not make sense. Now, that doesn't mean that Ban Ki-moon won't offer him a position or something. I don't know. But it would seem that wherever he is in this world, that I think he is a committed democratic activist, and he wants to see Kenya be democratic. There's a saying that Africa doesn't need big men, that it just needs strong institutions. I would amend that a little bit. I do believe that Africa needs good statesmen and good stateswomen, and I think that what Raila Odinga did showed that he's a statesman, and hopefully he'll continue to play that role.
I have to agree with my colleagues. You look at his family, you look at his background, you look at everything that he's done in his life, and it is very, very hard to imagine him not continuing to have an impact on Kenyan politics. But what that role and title will be, I think it will be up to his invention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for coming to testify today. And Mr. Fagan, I'd like to start with you. You mentioned in your testimony about the political parties are still in need of reform, as they are really not based on a platform or ideological point of view. Do you think locally politicians understand that need for reform? And I guess the second follow-up to that is, do you see that improving or changing?
No. I'm not pessimistic about the parties in Kenya, but if you do look at them from a holistic approach, for, especially in the past two election cycles, politicians jump from one political party to another. Under the 2002 elections, most of them coalesced around the NARC coalition, basically to defeat KANU and Uhuru Kenyatta in his first attempt at the presidency. So, politics is a game of coalition building, and in and of itself is not a bad thing. But these political parties tend to be led by individuals that are driven by, ethnic groupings. But what I think about these elections, and even though these political parties, there's a lot of basis on ethnicity and where they come from, and that's part of the calculus when putting these coalitions together. Can we get the Luo population? Can we get the Luya population? Can we get the Kamba population? Can we, which populations can we get? Can we get the coast? Those calculations certainly go into it. But what we saw in these elections was a lot of talk about issues, certainly. And I don't want to just, keep on bringing up the presidential debate, but that was historic, having 2 presidential debates. And these debates, it puts our debates to shame. No offense to President Obama or Governor Romney, but you knew exactly what they were going to say. These guys were going at each other, talking about the most troubling issues, facing Kenya, the ICC, land issues, the issues that really matter to Kenyans. So I'm positive and optimistic that the political parties will be reformed. There needs to be a lot done on the internal processes, party democracy.
So are you suggesting that as we reform those, the presidential debates will become more like ours?
We'll see. We'll see.
I hope not.
I hope not either. It was very refreshing to watch the debates. But I think the parties have a long way to go in the area of internal party democracy, ensuring that more people are able to get to those elected positions fairly. There's a lot of money that goes around. Women were left out of the process quite a bit. So there needs to be a lot more done in the area of political party reform, especially in the area of financial reform.
Well, and so as we look at that, are you saying that that's part of our focus, is to help them with the reform of their political parties? Because that's a pretty far reach. I mean, we're taking really a worldview and a society that culturally has been that way for a lot longer than we've been in existence, and trying to say, okay, we want you to be devoid of that, and now all of a sudden support a platform and become political. Is that, I'll let each one of you, Dr. Jennings, I can see, can you comment on that?
Oh, I'd love to, sir. We've been working with political parties in Kenya specifically for the last 5 years. I think they've made tremendous progress. They may not necessarily be ideologically driven, but the issues now are being addressed more and more. They have put forth manifestos that did not come from some consultant somewhere who was hired to put it together for them. The parties are debating. One of the parties whose candidate was, in fact, the only woman running for president, their party was perhaps one of the best organized parties in Kenya. The TNA, the Uhuru Kenyatta's party,
Right.
ODM, those were real parties. And I'm sure that if I was Kenyatta, I would be trying to attract people to my side too when you look at the numbers within Parliament. I think it is an area that U.S. Government funding should continue. The work that we've done as a party institute is to try to support the building of more democratically structured parties. And we run campaigns called Stick to the Issues, because if I vote for you because you're from my village or from my neighborhood and I don't have water, well, what good is that to me if my real issue is having clean water and some sanitation? So by raising real issues, it allows the political parties to be closer to the people and to be structured a little bit differently. And I think it is an appropriate area for U.S. government support.
Mr. Sweeney?
I'm going to answer this first from the IFAS perspective, and then the second from a personal perspective, if I may indulge you. From the IFAS perspective, we work with the election management bodies. We leave the working with political parties to the party institutes and to other organizations like that around the world. On a personal basis, I worked with Chairman Fassell many, many years ago to help create the National Endowment for Democracy.
Right.
And the idea was that the political party model was something that we wanted to introduce as a country, as a philosophy, into newly emergent democratic systems. And by and large, I would argue that the introduction of the democratic model and the political party system as a way of organizing has served many countries very, very well, and I commend the work of both the Republican and the Democratic and the German and the Austrian and a whole variety of other countries as they introduce their party models. Now, speaking as someone who spent a decade working for a political party, with the closeness of these numbers and the history of Kenya's moving alliances, it wouldn't surprise me if there's not going to be a fair amount of political reform in the next few years by the political parties as they try and address the electorate at the next election. And that's how it should be. And as long as that process is open and free and clear, that's one of the reasons why the National Endowment was created by the Congress after President Reagan's speech at Westminster that we're all remembering because of Mrs. Thatcher's funeral. And it's an investment that's been paid off very, very well by the democracies around the world that have invested in that dialogue, in my judgment.
Is there a danger where we look at the sovereignty of a nation like Kenya or any others, and where we come in and try to assist them in that process, where we infiltrate their worldview? I don't sense that, but I just thought I would.
If I may respond, yes, there is the danger. But you're also dealing with the professional politicians of a country. And they tend to be able to speak up for their country, for their countrymen and women, for their own interests. These are not, these are professional politicians. And if you as an outsider, even in terms of our work with the technical side of running an election, if you cross over the line, you get pushed back. Your advice is not followed. You are no longer welcome. And I suspect that's true of political party work as well.
Mr. Fagan?
What I would say in the case of Kenya in particular is when we're working with political parties, and we haven't worked with political parties during this election cycle, NDI has done that much more, is that we'd be working with them on trying to follow their own laws
Right.
So it's not as if we're trying to influence them in their ideology or whatnot. We're just trying to help them follow their own laws when
So
they're not.
undergirding the rule of law and the importance thereof?
Exactly.
Okay.
Mr. Meadows, it's important that the point that you raised, it can be perceived as imposition. And so how you engage and how you work is very important. You have to adopt culturally appropriate methods. We have to make sure that mutual respect, all of the principles of effective aid, respect for the host country's understanding of who you are, even. And the point that I was making earlier about tremendous progress,
Right.
there were 33,000 polling streams.
Okay.
And the Kenyan political parties, the two main parties, covered 80% of those or more.
Yeah.
So the level of organization is there. And they do want to learn from us, especially because Kenya is a hub for information and communications technology, and the innovations that have been made by the political parties, especially in the last 2 elections, they do want to understand that. So I think it's how we engage more than any kind of pushback on imposition.
Well said. Mr. Chairman, do I have time for one more question? Okay. Mr. Fagan, you mentioned the importance, I think in your testimony, of civic and non-governmental organizations as they affected the voting, the role of the voters, and education. What do you see as the greatest threat to that involvement of those NGOs or civic organizations? Because you said, we need to continue to grow that, and there seemed to be an implication that if we didn't have that, that the whole system would be undermined.
Yeah,
What do you see as the greatest threat?
Well, I don't think there would be a threat to our continued support to civil society. In fact, I think civil society plays a huge and important role in Kenyan society. And when I say civil society, I'm also including faith-based groups. This includes churches, mosques, and other groups that provide services to Kenyans in general when the government cannot. We work very closely with civic organizations throughout the country. I don't even know how many counties our staff covered, but we trained directly 50,000 Kenyans. This is our staff of about 6 to 7 people, going throughout the country and training people on what the election means, the whole devolution process, 50,000 people. And that doesn't include what we call our training of trainers programs, which probably impacted hundreds of thousands, and the radio programs that we sponsored, which we hope millions of people listen to. So our support, whether it's through IRI, through the National Endowment for Democracy, or the USAID, it's invaluable. And right now, I think the question was asked about this PBO law, this public benefit law. Mm-hmm. We don't know what kind of impact that will actually have on civic organizations. But the country that's being thrown around, and I don't necessarily believe this, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has very strong laws against civic organizations and foreign funding, and we hope that doesn't happen in the Kenyan case. Civic organizations just play an enormous role in Kenya. They were prominent in bringing multi-party democracy to Kenya in 1992.
Right.
So they're very important sector
So that would
to
be
society.
the threat is to follow, quote, the Ethiopian model that may or may not be accurate.
Oh, we hope not. And
Okay. Thank you. And I'll yield back to the chair, but I would ask if any of you have for your testimony, when you talk about the public procurement issues and what would be some of those issues that you could respond to the committee and let us know anything that needs to be highlighted and looked at from a congressional standpoint, that would be very welcome. Thank each of you for your testimony, and I yield back to the chairman.
Mr. Meadows, thank you so very much. I would just note parenthetically that speaking about political parties, most of us have seen the absence of it and the chaos it produces when there isn't a family. And when there's a two-party system, yes, other parties should participate, but very often things don't happen. Governance is set back, and it often leads to chaos. But I would note that Greg Simpkins was the Deputy Regional Director for IRI back in the early 1990s, working on just that, building political parties. So, on this committee, we're very appreciative to have him as our top African expert on the subcommittee. I'd like to now yield to the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Weber, gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up your remarks about the absence of political parties, that's probably why Mark Twain said he didn't vote for politicians, because it just encouraged them. So maybe he was on to something there. Mr. Fagan, I've got some questions for you. Was IRI, well, actually, these are questions for all three of you. Was IRI involved in the 2007 election?
We had a program there, yes.
You had a program. How about you, Dr. Jennings?
Yes, sir. We did not have a big program, but we were there.
Mr. Sweeney?
We had a modest program as well.
Okay. At what point were you, and you may have never left, and these are questions for all three of you again, at what point were you all able to come back in? I mean, there was a lot of violence. Did you have to exit because of that violence?
No. Staff was there through, we've had a permanent presence on the ground since 2002.
Okay, so
So there was no exodus whatsoever.
y'all have been there the whole time?
Correct.
Dr. Jennings?
We did not evacuate our staff, but we were in touch. We only had a small staff of about 5 or 6 people. We were in touch with them on a regular basis during that period.
Okay, Mr. Sweeney?
Same.
So it's safe to say that y'all remained on the ground there during the last 6 years.
Correct.
At what point did you gear up to start ensuring that the 2013 elections were different?
In our case, shortly after we saw that the international observation failed, there were not civil society groups that were observing the election. And we thought that if there was a parallel vote tabulation in 2007, maybe some of the violence could have been avoided. So we set out in our conversations with USAID and other development partners to say for the 2013 elections, we think this is what needs to be done.
And when was that? Was that in 2008, 2010?
Yes, in 2008.
2008.
Yeah. But we had a presence in Kenya since the mid-1990s.
Okay, well, I'm specifically focusing between the time of the 2007, 2013. And Mr. Sweeney, how about IFES?
IFES was involved with, in dialogue with the Election Commission as it was being organized. They participated in our November 2010 election program here in the United States. Our meetings continued, and I would say we staffed up in a major way and started a major program in the summer of 2011.
Okay, so y'all did not leave. Y'all were there and you had a presence on the ground, and you started 2007, 2008. And Mr. Fagan, when did you start gearing up for 2013?
Well, we had continuous programs. So as soon as, the violence probably died down and whatnot, we continued doing our work with our partners, which at the time was mainly with Parliament, members of Parliament.
Okay. So one of the complaints
2008.
I heard y'all testify about was the procurement process, that it didn't go smoothly, it didn't run well. And if y'all were there for so long, why didn't y'all help them begin that process early on?
I think the procurement issues were mostly around the Election Commission's procurements. We did advise the Election Commission on a number of options. There were a number of procurements that took place. Some of those procurements became controversial, not all of them. The Election Commission followed its own procedures on many. On some, it was, frankly, ran into some difficulties within their own government.
Were they short funding?
I'd have to check on the funding issue, on the because we're dealing with a multiple of issues that created the perception that my colleague referenced.
Okay, and Mr. Fagan, you said that women were supposed to be the big winners,
Right.
but they really weren't. Number one, why were they supposed to be? Number two, why weren't they?
Well, under the new Constitution, they're supposed to have at least 1/3 representation within all the legislative bodies, and the courts actually ruled that this can be gradually implemented
Okay.
and not implemented.
And so the
in
numbers
this.
the numbers just aren't there yet.
Correct.
Okay. You also stated that Kenya benefited from other international donors. during your testimony. What other donors were you talking about?
Well, I'd probably let Keith talk more of that, because we only had U.S. government funding.
Okay.
The European donors, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Dutch, the British also were very, through their development organization, DFID, they were very involved and may have been the largest contributor to the Kenya electoral process.
Any Chinese money?
No. I think the Chinese position is that we are not involved in the political process. And that's based on my knowledge of above what takes place in other places.
Above board, at least.
Yes.
And so I'm getting back to what my colleague over here, Mr. Meadows, said. What's the biggest threat? I'm trying to see if there's any other outside influences trying to come in and play in this arena. And I think I hear you say, Dr. Jennings, that not.
But the Chinese are very present, and that's one of the issues that may have been fueling some of the more nationalist tendencies, because there seems to be an alternative to the West. And the Chinese were the first to congratulate Mr. Uhuru on his victory even before the courts had ruled.
Okay. Mr. Sweeney, you said that the elections were a process and not an event, I think was the way you stated that. There was a list, you said the official, I think, paper list, when the electronics kind of bit the dust, so to speak, then someone maintained an official list. Who maintained that official list?
The international, the IEBC developed the voter list as part of the voter registration process. The list I referenced was a paper list that had photo identification that came off of the voter registration process, so that if a voter came to a polling station and they were not using the computer-based biometric registration, which was triggered by a thumbprint, they could then go to the official paper list and find that voter's information. And that's what I was referencing, sir.
Okay, and pardon my lack of knowledge on Kenya, do they all speak the same language?
Yes and no. Yes, the official languages are English and Swahili, but there are about 40 to 50 tribal languages as well.
Right.
Okay.
And in some places, it differs the level of fluency in those.
All right, and then also, Mr. Sweeney, you said that the election law allowed for provisional ballots.
No, there was provisional reporting, sir.
Provisional reporting.
Provisional report, the way the system worked was on election night, they would count for the presidential, and they could report that count by cell phone to the National Tally Center.
I got you.
That provisional number was then made public.
Okay.
Okay, to the media,
Subject
to
to
the political
change.
parties. However, that was subject to change.
Subject to change. Here's my question about that.
Yes, sir.
How long was that law, if you will, or that ability to provisionally report in place? Did that exist in the 2007 election?
It did not exist in the 2007 election. The provisional results were accepted and broadcast by the Election Commission for 3 days following the election. Then the Election Commission announced that the provisional reporting system, which they were not satisfied with, was ending, and now they were going to the official count. And the official count was reviewing the paper ballots and the election forms submitted by each polling station, and then announcing those official results. And they announced those official results over the course of the next 4.5 days until they declared that they did not need to go to a runoff.
Okay, I got you. And so I think it might have been you, Mr. Fagan, who said, I'm trying to remember multiple testimonies here, who said that you think about 51% of the country, or maybe it was you, Dr. Jennings, believes in the system. You kind of,
I said that.
I see the monkey getting on your back, Mr. Fagan.
I only said that because, you know, there was about just over 50% of the population that voted for Uhuru Kenyatta.
Okay, so you're going strictly by voting
Correct.
numbers. And then also, Mr. Sweeney, you said IEBC candidates were selected by the Parliament.
Yes, sir.
2 questions. How many how many is on the IEBC, number one, and is there that kind of faith in that board as well, that commission?
First of all, I believe it's an 11-person commission, but let me double-check that for you. There were well over 150 candidates who applied for consideration to the Parliament. The Parliament had a specific screening committee and went through an exhaustive process to finally bring candidates before the Parliament to be voted on.
High-level integrity, better than the India model, I think you said.
That's what I said, sir. Yes, sir.
Is there faith in the country in that process, or was there were there cries, corruption, cronyism, favoritism?
No, sir. I think the country was more than willing to entrust the IEBC with the responsibility for conducting the election. There was a number of public flurries around some procurement issues. There was some dissatisfaction when the provisional vote system did not work as well as expected. As one who was in some of those meetings, I can tell you the IEBC commissioners and staff were even more dissatisfied than what was on the news media. But by and large, I think the country and after they went through the process, which was established by the law, the Supreme Court was able to review all of that, and Kenyans were able to credibly accept the results.
Okay, and the last question for you on that subject is there I started my questioning with you guys of, how long were you there? Why didn't you act sooner, basically? We want to be gearing up perhaps for next elections. Okay, when is that?
2017.
2017.
Next elections are 2017.
Okay. Is there a process in place with the IEBC so that they're holding forums, whether it's town halls, public meetings? Do they hold their meetings openly? And are Kenyans getting a chance to buy in and participate?
As I said in my testimony, we're already in the process of planning the first meeting with the IEBC on the lessons learned and how do we go forward. Every election will inevitably produces a set of reforms, some of which are legislative, some of which are administrative, some of which are simply practices.
Okay.
And I suspect all of that will be developed now that the court has ruled and the process is moving forward.
And that will be in the public domain?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then last question, Dr. Jennings, you said that the judges had to be vetted.
Yes, sir.
By who?
It was a public process that included people drawn from a number of places, but ultimately it was the Parliament.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Weber, let me just go back to one thing that you raised. Part of the reason that those of us who were not working with the IEBC raised this issue of the procurement, it was because they had the highest approval rating of any institution in the country. And so many Kenyans felt let down because they had invested so much confidence in the IEBC. And in the pre-election period, it was critical because of this polarization. So we're not attacking the IEBC as being incompetent or as perhaps being corrupt, but it was the public perception, and that was that way only because such a high standard had been held, and they had performed so well during the constitutional reform process. So I think it was the politics of the political environment that caused people to have less confidence. And the reason that this electoral reform issue is so important is because it's what now the opposition, Raila Odinga, has raised in his court challenge, that some of the counties, we should know soon, once the IEBC releases the official forms, may have voted more than 100%. We do know officially 17 counties voted in the 90% rate. And that's why you have such a almost even 6 million versus 5.5 million.
Right. Well, I get that. When you talked about the procurement process, I think it was Mr. Sweeney in his remarks said that, when you try to institute electronic, I forget how he said it, voting and whatever, that a lot tried to be done in a short amount of time, basically. And so all I'm driving at is we want to make sure we have a policy in place that says, by golly, they ought to be instituting that right now. They ought to be going back to that process, rebuilding that confidence, and making sure this process is in place. And that's what my question is aimed at. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Very much, Mr. Weber. Before we conclude, I just want to ask, in your view, will any of the election laws, which obviously have been done very quickly, have to be revisited and updates provided pursuant to lessons learned? And secondly, Mr. Sweeney, in your testimony, you mentioned that election technology helps mitigate certain types of fraud, but it also opens the door to more technologically advanced forms of fraud. And perhaps you might want to elaborate on that, and then we'll conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, every election that I've seen results in an agenda for change for the next election. There will always be improvements in the process, and that's healthy. And I suspect that I already know that there is discussion as to what parts of the Kenyan election law and regulation and process need to be changed, need to be looked at, and they will be looked at in a completely public way so as to maintain public trust in the integrity of the election process. When I said, in my testimony, I make the point that technology oftentimes has unanticipated consequences. And thus, the stupidest way to try and steal an election is through ballot stuffing. Far better to figure out how to program the computers on results, okay, which is done far away. Now, I will also say that we had some of the world's best experts in the computer process around elections, so as to make certain that the Kenyan process was completely protected, contained, safe both from rumors about being hacked into and the reality of being hacked into. But you can see over time, people try and think they're smarter than other systems. The one thing that I would caution people about is not to live by anecdote. When you're looking at trying to shift the outcome of a national election, you're not talking about one or two examples of voter fraud. You've got to find hundreds of thousands of votes cast. And in the case of Kenya, the IEBC spent months working to make sure that such errors, be they administrative, in simply clerks writing down the wrong number, or deliberate, could not happen, and that there was accountability. In the election form per polling station, you had not only the signatures of all the election officials present who had management responsibilities, but all the party observers present by party, attesting to the fact that the number that was going on those forms were the numbers that they had all witnessed. And they were all under penalty of criminal law if they were lying. It was a very, very robust system, very well thought out, and then very well executed. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, let me first say thank you for holding this hearing and giving us an opportunity to comment. I do think that the reason I said in the beginning of my statement that elections are political processes is precisely because of this. If you have a polarized political environment, with one side getting 5.5 million votes, another getting over 6 million, and the difference is 4,000 votes, our level of confidence, or the Kenyan people's level of confidence, has to be absolute, especially when the board that was in the Boma, the returning center, didn't add up. And so the logical thing for one side that's committed to the democratic process is to go to court. It was a legitimate decision by Odinga. Having said that, it is now up to those who have been elected and certified by the Supreme Court to continue the reform process. In my estimation, the electoral reform that is most needed is to the legal framework. There were a number of things unanswered. But I would also say, and I'm sure that will be done because I know we're meeting with the political parties and that's on the agenda. But I would also say that this issue of space for civil society is one of the most critical things. But perhaps of all of the things that the U.S. is well positioned, given our federal system, to assist the Kenyans with is the devolution process. And I think there's a lot that could be learned, whether it's the National Governors Association or the National Association of State and County and Local Officials, that can be shared, and that would make sense in this context. But I think that we have the luxury of sitting here. I'm not a politician. I don't have anything against politicians either. But I think in the heat of the moment in Kenya, the way that this election was handled and the role of the Supreme Court was absolutely critical. And I think now people are willing to work together to move on for the future of that country.
Just getting back quickly to Mr. Weber's point of time, when looking at these elections, at the next elections, now is the time to act. And I would echo what Dr. Jennings said, especially in the area of, where we should really look at our assistance would be on this devolution process and making sure it works. I know that the ring gets larger. But also getting back to your point, about the laws, electoral laws, I think it's a lot about enforcing the laws. A lot changed since 2010 with the new Constitution, and therefore those laws need to be implemented, especially in the area of political party reform. We saw in the primaries they didn't go as well as they could have. Parties missed deadlines, et cetera. So we really need, or they need to really focus on just implementing their own laws. What else is there? But it is a constant process. I mean, this is the first election held under this new constitution and new framework. Obviously, changes will probably be needed to be reviewed and assessed. But I would implore upon them that they need to do it now, rather than wait until 18 months before an election.
Thank you. We will conclude the hearing. I do want to thank you for your extraordinary expertise. We benefit here, but most importantly, people on the ground in Kenya and elsewhere are the greatest beneficiaries. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for spending the better part of this afternoon conveying all of this wisdom to this subcommittee, which we will use it and do our very best to see that you and your efforts are adequately resourced, particularly in these tough budget times. So thank you so very, very much, and the hearing is adjourned.